the excavations, one of the commonest finds is actually animal bone, which is kind of ironic because Dominicans were to have a very diet that was generally regarded as meat-free, but clearly they were eating meat. And in fact here we have a piece of bone where you can see the butchery marks. It's been cut by a knife either side. We know that there were cattle bone, pig bone, we have some pig teeth here, sheep, and we also have horse bone, although I doubt they're eating horse, or I hope not. So this is a tiny, tiny proportion of all the animal bone that we've found. Another element of indicating the daily life of the friars is the pottery that we have. Now, obviously they cooked, and cooking at the time was often done using pottery, a particular kind of ceramic, Leinster cooking ware, hand built, and you can see all the mica and quartz in it, which helped diffuse the heat when it was over a flame. We have some nice bases of pots here. We have little different shaped jars and so on, and pieces from much bigger curved vessels, wheel thrown in this instance, and as I said, hand thrown in the case of the Leinster cooking ware. We also have pottery that is not local. We're assuming that most of this material here, not all of it, but the vast proportion is actually either made locally or definitely in Ireland. However, there is material that came in from France, for example. This is a piece of Santange ware, and this is another lovely piece with a little decorative motifs on it. This is a replica Santange jug, and Santange comes from a particular area in France. And how did French pottery get into Ireland and to the monks? Well, they drank wine. They also used wine in the mass, and so they would be buying wine. And merchants often, when they sold wine, threw in a couple of free jugs as a marketing ploy. So that's how much of this French ware came into the country. Obviously, for these religious, they had their own particular pattern of work to do. And for the Dominicans, study and books were hugely important. And as we talked about earlier, we have a place in the site on the East Range which we think was actually where books were read, studied, and even written. These objects here relate to books. So this is actually the clasp that would have been on the end of a strap. There would have been a piece of leather extending from this, and it would have been used to hold a manuscript together. If you can imagine a manuscript bound with a leather cover, and then a strap fastened onto the cover with a spike sticking up in it, and this at the other end. So when you pulled it around the strap, you stuck the spike through that hole there, and there was your book kept safely closed. This is lovely. It's a little 14th century piece, and you see the knop at the end of it like an acorn. That's actually quite a common decorative motif of the time. These little objects are really nice. They are what's called manuscript prickers. There's a little iron spike there. This is a nicely decorated piece of bone. We thought it was ivory when we found it first, but no, it's bone that's just been so highly polished it didn't discolour. And I don't know if you can see, but there's a nice little interlace pattern. And this would have been used by somebody to mark out, to score lines, and to mark points where they would have drawn lines, and even to initial the letters so that when the ink went into the vellum, it flowed very nicely. Objects like these have been found in other contexts, and we know that they're around 13th to 14th century in date. There's a nice little turned head on that one. And this piece is one of our most prized finds. The excitement when that was found by a student, and by us actually, we were just thrilled. What is it? People said, oh, it's a monkey. No, it's not. It's a dog. It's a dog sitting on a desk. This is made from probably a hare's femur, not a rabbit, a hare, because it would have had a long leg. And it's a dog sitting on a desk because dogs are associated with Dominicans. In fact, there's a pun. Domine Canis means hounds of the Lord, and is another way of saying Dominicans. St. Dominic, there are legends about Dominic and his mother seeing a dog with a burning brand in her mouth. So we're convinced that this is a dog, and he's sitting on a desk because the Dominicans always had somebody who taught them, known as the lector. And the word lectern comes from the same root, lectern meaning desk. And we think that this was a gift to somebody who was the lector of the time. This would be 14th century in date, and that he might have worn it as a pen to hold his cloak together, or used it to turn pages or point out something if he was teaching. So this for us has become our symbol. It's representative part of the Dominicans' mission and their dedication to learning. So what other interesting bone objects have we got? Well, these we think are tuning pegs. So clearly somebody here had musical instruments. They're very delicate and beautifully made. And this is part of a bone comb. Vanity, you might say, but think about it. The Dominicans' hair grew like everybody else's, but they also had to have a tonsure. So at some point, every month or so, they needed to get their heads shaved, the central part of the head, to have that tonsure, which is this maintenance of a bald crown, as it were. And also, they would have had their beards trimmed or shaved entirely. So razors and knives must have been, and scissors even, would have been part of the daily equipment. And we have found very corroded pieces of iron that might well have been originally such objects. We have a piece that may have functioned as a bone spindle whorl. It's from the joint end, the ball of a ball and socket joint, and a stick would have been put through that, and then wool threaded around the stick and spun. So I don't know if this is a later object, because its context was in actually the demolition rubble. So it could have been related to the later farm activities in the site. But the Dominicans wore woolen cloaks and woolen tunics. So perhaps they actually spun their own wool as well, and perhaps even wove it, for all we know. So we move on now to some of our really nice metal objects. The Dominicans, as I've said, wore a tunic, and that was fastened with a belt. And from the belt was suspended a rosary beads, as they had great devotion to Our Lady. And if you look at some of these objects, this is like a little clasp, or part of a buckle, sorry. And there would have been leather attached here, so it's the strap end. This is a beautiful little object with very nice decoration on it. And again, there's a fragment of leather stuck in there, and you can see there's a suspension loop there. This little object is also indicative of something suggesting personal possessions, which again in a priory or a friary should be quite unusual. But maybe there was a money chest or a casket with papers, I'm not sure, but this is a little casket key. We come here to these three objects. These are ring brooches, a pair of ring brooches. In fact, a matched set, because we found these last summer during our excavations within the church, where we uncovered the remains of an elderly man, and these were actually on his hip bones, suggesting that they had been fastening a belt that was around his hips. His position, buried at the step of the altar, suggests that he might have been a prior. And these are of a type of ring brooch that are early in the series, and therefore 13th century in date. So we might actually have had the remains of the first prior at the Blackfriary. We really don't know. And these are little shroud pins, not from the same burial, but from other burials around the site. So people were generally wrapped in shrouds. The Dominicans would have been buried in their habits, but the ordinary people would have been buried in shrouds, and the shrouds held together by pins that just look like modern dressmakers' pins, but are actually medieval. The last thing I'm just going to show you, or the last two things, money. There were a few coins found in the site, and they're always useful because they're dateable. This one is again 14th century in date, and came from part of the area we were excavating last summer above some graves. So we can say that the person buried below them was buried before that coin could have been made. And the last thing then is this lovely brooch or mount with gilding on it. But you see the roses? This suggests that it's actually a Tudor piece. And this must have been somebody's personal property. It wasn't with a burial. It was in a slightly disturbed context, but it could have been something that was either left on an altar as an offering or dropped on the floor, or maybe was actually with a burial, but that was disturbed at the time of the demolition. So this is just a tiny introduction to the finds that we've made here over the years. But they give us this terrific glimpse into the daily life, not just of the friars, but of the everyday people who came in and out of the place as well.